The Fianna Trilogy is a series of books that provides a factually correct, yet dramatised look at the final years of Ireland's most famous warriors. It takes a sharp but honest look at those that were eventually going to become household names, such as Fionn, Oisin and Cuilta, and it recalibrates their lives within the context of the times. Historical truths are adhered to, but careful analysis turns much of the later Christian propaganda on its head, as the author looks for genuine reasons for the whos and whys that made up the stories of that time. The trilogy begins with a retelling of the famous pursuit of Diarmid and Grania story, and entertains a very real possibility that a people other than simply the Celts had their hands in how the events played out. It also looks critically at the power play at Tara that ultimately led to the Fianna being outlawed and declared an enemy of the people. The second book gives a truthful recounting of the famous Battle of Gowra that ultimately brought the Fianna to their end. Genuine reasons are given for different people being on different sides of the battle, so that we know that by the time everyone arrives at the scene, we understand their motivations and hopes. By the time we are knee-deep in the final part of the trilogy, we get to understand some of the leading Tuatha characters, and the time disparity that separates the land of the Celts from the land of Tir na Nog. Understanding that these are different people with different powers to the human Celts is a key ingredient of understanding many of Ireland's ancient stories. Allowing our minds to stretch to the possibilities of different worlds experiencing time on a different level is a key factor in being able to understand that these people were not gods or fairies, but that they possessed some very real powers that we humans either lost or never had. The stories fit together in time and shine a light on Ireland's historical swan song before the adoption of Christianity in the 5th century. These are times and stories that have been rewritten in the 7th and 8th centuries to fit a Christian message and the confines that any religion will place on happenings that don't fit within its narrative. But this trilogy stands separate to the lore that these monks wrote of and brings real men and women and the events that engulfed them into a clearer focus. The Ancient Ireland series is a trilogy based on the time frame of what is commonly referred to as the Ulster cycle. While the 3 books can indeed stand alone, their characters sometimes play out across multiple stories. For example, Queen Maeve plays a role in all 3 books, allowing her story to grow beyond what historians of the 7th century painted for her. While much of the history of the time was rewritten by Christian monks several hundred years later, it wasn't too difficult to spot the propaganda of their versions and weed it out in order to deliver a more truthful and realistic story. Yes, there's a degree of dramatization that is logic and event-based, but the stories themselves stay as true as possible to the timeline and nature of historical events and characters. As you might expect, there are indeed heroes and villains, but they're rarely represented in pure black and white terms. Their humanity is a construct of both their good and bad sides, and even the archetypal hero himself, Cuchulainn, is shown in his flawed reality rather than the demigod approach used by some writers. These heroes hail from 2,000 years ago, and much of the magic and mystery had been ironed out of them by modern people unable or unwilling to believe that perhaps another race did exist in a parallel world that interacted with the Celtic world itself. This style of writing sticks to the old storyteller style, and while its descriptive approach is never going to capture the interest of the Pulitzer Prize Committee, it claims a similarity to the traditional Shanachie that graced the taverns and hallowed halls of Ireland as the country's history was shared from generation to generation. The 3 sorrows of Irish storytelling are well known in their classical forms to almost every man, woman and child in the country. But in this retelling, the author has looked closely at each tale and extracted the senseless drivel and religious propaganda and developed the stories fully to be consistent with the times and the people involved in them. The stories are standalone and true to any historical framework of their predecessors, but after careful analysis have been rewritten in a manner that's consistent with not simply the main element of their stories, but also the people that play a pivotal role. The first sorrow is the tragic tale of the children of Lir, and the evil that was imposed on them by their cruel aunt. But rather than the tales of magic and spells that culminate in a religious awakening after 900 years, this story adheres to the more logical and practical manner that the children's lives played out over a 9-year period. The story of the Sons of Tuireann is that of a blood quest demanded in response to the death of someone's father. Rather than run with the vilification of the young men themselves, which essentially makes it sound like they get what they deserve, this retelling follows the more plausible approach that the death was actually an accident. Thus, the sympathy for the magnitude of the tasks ahead of them, and the price that they pay in pursuit, is commensurate with how the events more than likely played out. The third sorrow is the tragic tale of the sons of Uisneach. Given the holes in the story written by the 6th century monks, and their attempt to sanctify one of the most villainous kings that had ever ruled Ulster, the research for this retelling involved looking beyond the story itself and examine the evolution of the country to a Tara-based High King, and how this would have caused these young men to become the victims they ultimately did. The Trilogy of the Three Sorrows casts an unapologetic eye over those that may have been written about in exalted terms, and casts them in the true light that history deserves. Sorrowful though they are, these stories allow us to place the heroes and villains in exactly the right column, and to do so without the influence of those that seek to deliver a message that distorts them. The Irish Queen's trilogy ignores the most well-known of strong female characters from its past, given that Queen Maeve's story is covered fully within the Ancient Ireland trilogy. But this time, the limelight falls on 3 perhaps lesser-known women that proved to be major figures of their time, and yet they've been largely ignored by those in later years that strove to define Ireland's history only in patriarchal or misogynistic terms. The first of these stories comes in the northwest of the country and plays out almost entirely off the coast of Donegal. Cuireannach is a woman historically documented as a sea serpent by those looking to vilify her. But this retelling points to the fact that she hailed from the Tuatha Dé race, and therefore her ability to shapeshift was an important skill set that she carried. This retelling also highlights her involvement in protecting the seal population in those waters, and to the final integration of the Selkie population that had been separated from an Ireland that they so longed to be a part of. The second of these stories is set primarily in the southwest, and in the time when the Tuatha Dé race is handing off Ireland to the victorious Celtic peoples. At a time when Manannán mac Lir set up the first of the Banshees to gather the souls of the dead, Cliona became their appointed queen, as they grew in number and their role became pivotal in the death, rebirth, or final passage of the Irish for thousands of years beyond. It's a wonderful retelling that seeks to explain the parameters by which death was handled, and her own role in establishing what was initially seen as a positive role at a time of death. The third queen of the trilogy was Nia, who for a brief time became queen of the Deshi people that populated the demi-province of Ossory. Her allegiance to Fionn and the Fianna and the King of Munster was a powerful base upon which she built a homeland for what were initially a homeless people. The story pivots on the machinations of those around her who would undo the province building that she had done, and it finally rests on her willingness to put her people above her own interests. This trilogy of Queen stories have been a long time waiting to be told, and after careful analysis and research, the author has developed a broad brushstroke that repositions Irish women within historical leader roles that a patriarchal, message-driven base had long sought to dismiss. The current trilogy being worked on is about the English effect in Ireland. From their initial invasion to the failed attempt to remove them in 1798, to the famine that they were instrumental in mismanaging in the mid-1800s, this trilogy focused on historically accurate accounts that provide flushed-out views on influential characters at the time. The first of these is the published book named Portals, which is a reference to the portals that were in use for millennia beforehand between Tir na Nog and the land of the Celts. The arrival of the English and their insatiable desire for wealth, land, and the search for a fountain of youth caused severe damage and loss to the Celts and a threat to Tir na Nog that ultimately would lead to its closure. This book is unforgiving in assigning the blame for the circumstance that the Irish found themselves in. Beyond the parasitic behaviour of the Anglo-Normans, the selfish ego of a fallen Irish king, the hateful desire of a Catholic Church to sell out its own congregation, and the inadequacies of a splintered system of rule in Ireland, they're all called out as historic individuals try their best to prevent the inevitable. The second book of the series is now transitioning from research mode and will be released in early 2025. It will provide an insight into the failed rebellions of 1798 and the major characters that sought an independence for Ireland, along with the characters that sought to sell them out for a cruel English throne. Whether it was for 30 pieces of silver or title, or even to curry favour that emboldened their feelings of importance, those that supported the crown eventually won the day and Ireland paid the cost. The third book is in planning stage and will be set during the Great Famine that swept through Ireland from 1845 to 1852 and took the lives of over 1 million Irish men and women and children who died of starvation. Coupled with the extreme emigration efforts of those fortunate enough to have a chance of survival, the population of the country dropped by another 3 million, such that from having 8.5 million residents in 1840, there were only just over 4 million by 1900. Within this framework, the book will focus on the extraordinary lives of several key individuals who endeavoured not simply for their own survival, but the salvation of others. They faced not only the natural hardships of failing food supplies, but the Machiavellian efforts of others, happy in their own fortunes, regardless of the cost on others.